Welcome to Shadow of Truth. I'll be gone in the dark. The writer who hunted a ghost, the voices in the files. Subscribe if you think you could stare into the dark and not blink. Because tonight, we're stepping into a case that haunted California for decades, and the woman who refused to stop looking. The story begins in the quiet glow of a desk lamp. Stacks of police reports, faded photographs, and yellowing notebooks fill the table. Somewhere between the coffee stains and midnight scribbles, Michelle McNamara stares at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. She has spent years buried in the darkness of a mystery most had tried to forget, the case of a man known only as the Golden State Killer. California, 1970s. A place of sunshine, palm trees, and serial fear. Someone had been moving silently through its neighborhoods, breaking into homes, attacking couples, vanishing before dawn. Dozens of victims, no fingerprints, no motive, just whispers left in the dark. Michelle wasn't a detective. She wasn't a cop. She was a writer, a true crime journalist who believed that stories could solve crimes. But when she stumbled upon this one, it didn't feel like a story. It felt like a haunting. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, used to joke that she married the case. Late at night, he'd find her at her desk, eyes locked on scanned crime scene notes, listening to old police dispatch recordings. "You can't live in there forever," he'd say. "Someone has to," she'd whisper back. The case itself had gone cold for decades. The Golden State Killer, once known by many other names. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, each nickname tied to a different wave of attacks across California. All connected, though no one realized it until much later. Michelle's obsession wasn't with the gore or the fame. It was with justice, with giving a face to a man who had stolen so many lives and vanished into the air. She began building what she called the case file, an enormous digital archive of every detail she could find. Police interviews, neighborhood maps, victim timelines, and geographic patterns that she pieced together like a puzzle. She used online forums, cold case databases, and even amateur detective groups. She talked to retired officers who hadn't spoken to anyone about the case in years. And slowly, in the quiet corners of her research, a pattern began to form. The killer was organized, methodical, and calculating. He often called victims before the attacks, whispering things like, "I'm watching you." He seemed to know their routines, their floor plans, their fears. He never took souvenirs, just left terror behind. The deeper Michelle dug, the more she realized something chilling. He had adapted over time. The same man who had burglarized homes in Visalia in 1974 was likely the one who committed the brutal murders in Orange County years later. He didn't disappear, he evolved. Michelle's blog, True Crime Diary, began gaining traction. Readers followed every update she posted. Her careful breakdowns of old evidence, her sketches of the suspect's psychological profile. But for her, it wasn't about popularity. It was about the weight of the silence left behind by a man who had taken so much. In one of her entries, she wrote, "He's out there, living among us, buying groceries, walking his dog. I don't want to scare you. I want to unmask him." Her obsession drew her closer to others who had once hunted him. Retired detectives like Paul Holes, who had also refused to let the case die. Together, they began re-examining DNA evidence using new forensic technology, something that hadn't existed back when the crimes occurred. And then, a glimmer. In 2016, a lab returned results had hinted at a possible genetic match. Not a name yet, but a direction. The kind of direction that could finally end decades of fear. Michelle's notes became more urgent. Her emails grew longer, her nights shorter. She often said that when she was writing, the killer was in the room with her, not physically, but in every shadow, every whisper, every unturned page. Friends worried, her husband worried more. But Michelle kept pushing, telling herself she was getting close, that if she stopped, he'd win again. "He's been gone too long," she wrote in her journal. "It's time to drag him back into the light." By spring of that year, she was preparing her next big article, one she believed could reignite national attention and force law enforcement to reopen key files. The title she scribbled on her notepad that night, "I'll be gone in the dark." A phrase the killer himself had once whispered to a victim. Now, it was the promise of a writer determined to end his story. As the camera pans out, the glow of Michelle's computer screen fades, leaving behind only the flicker of light across the crime map pinned to her wall, red strings connecting city after city across California. Each one a memory, each one a voice that refuses to fade, the man in the mask. The rain slid down the Los Angeles windows like time itself, washing away nothing. Michelle McNamara sat in her office surrounded by open folders, pages marked in yellow tabs, notes pinned in chaotic constellations. On one side of her desk, decades of unsolved attacks. On the other, a growing network of retired detectives and forensic experts who believed she might actually succeed where so many had failed. This wasn't journalism anymore. It was a crusade, the digital detective. She had begun cross-referencing crime scene data in ways the police had never tried. Her laptop hummed with maps, glowing red dots across the California suburbs: Sacramento, Stockton, Modesto, Irvine. Each dot represented a family that had once been terrorized by the same faceless intruder. Michelle zoomed in, comparing entry points, the dates of the full moons, even the nights of neighborhood baseball games. She noticed patterns in how he moved, east to west, like a shadow obeying the sunset. The killer didn't choose homes, he studied them. The realization gave her chills. Somewhere in those spreadsheets, she was looking right at him, just not yet recognizing his name. The voices of the past. Michelle began visiting victims who had survived. She never asked them to relive the horror. She asked about the moments before it happened. One woman remembered seeing a man riding a bike down her street, wearing a ski mask even though it was summer. Another remembered hearing heavy breathing outside her window, days before the attack. Every story added another brushstroke to the portrait of a man who once thought he'd never be caught. Michelle's empathy made people trust her. Unlike law enforcement interrogators, she listened, not to collect evidence, but to understand the psychology of fear. In her notebook, she wrote, "He's not superhuman, he's ordinary. And that's what makes him terrifying." The partnership. By 2015, her investigation had gained the attention of Paul Holes, a cold case investigator from Contra Costa County. Paul had been working on the same case for years, keeping boxes of evidence no one wanted to touch. When he first met Michelle, he said, "You think like a detective." They began collaborating quietly, trading theories, suspect lists, and DNA updates through encrypted emails. One night, Paul called her after midnight. "We might have something," he said. A DNA link between the East Area rapist and the murders in Orange County. Michelle barely slept. For the first time, the monster in her research felt less like a ghost and more like a man with fingerprints and blood. The trail of names. Every ad came with a new name, hundreds of them. Men who had lived near the crimes, owned similar vehicles, or matched vague witness descriptions. Michelle dug into property records, old-school yearbooks, and genealogy databases. She began cataloging them under code names: the hunter, the tactician, the engineer. Her office wall looked like a detective's war room, red yarn connecting faces, cities, and timelines. But behind the determination was exhaustion. She wrote in her journal, "Each clue opens 10 more doors. The dark doesn't end, it only expands." The cost of obsession. Her friends noticed the change. Her husband Patton would find her asleep on the couch at 3 a.m. Police files spread across her lap. She kept a notebook by the bed because she dreamed of the killer, not as a nightmare, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. Sometimes she'd wake up and whisper, "He's older now, he has to be." Her health began to waver, her anxiety grew heavier, but she told herself this was the cost of chasing justice. She wasn't afraid of the dark anymore, she lived there. The breakthrough. Then came the idea that would change everything. Michelle began exploring genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge approach that used public DNA databases to identify relatives of unknown suspects. She wasn't a scientist, but she knew someone out there shared this man's bloodline, and if they did, the web could finally tighten around him. She wrote an email to Paul, "If this works, the case will never be cold again." In the following weeks, they traced partial matches and mapped family trees that stretched across generations. Somewhere, among distant cousins and archived birth records, the Golden State Killer was hiding in plain sight. The pressure builds. Publishers wanted Michelle's story. Producers called it the next Zodiac, but she refused to sensationalize. Her book wasn't about horror, it was about persistence. She told an interviewer, "This isn't just about one man's crimes, it's about every person who was told this." The case was hopeless and kept digging anyway. Behind her calm voice, however, was the weight of sleepless nights and too much caffeine. The darkness was consuming her, inch by inch, the promise. Before leaving her desk one night, Michelle looked at the map that had defined her life for so long. A spider web of California pinned in red threads. She whispered to herself, "You're not invisible anymore." She saved her latest draft, titled it Chapter 12, The Man in the Mask, and closed her laptop. In that moment, she didn't know she was closer than ever, that the walls were already closing in on the man she'd been chasing for years. The light from her desk lamp flickered once, casting her reflection in the window. Behind her, the map glowed softly in the dark, a constellation of victims finally beginning to connect. The face in the light. It was the quiet before dawn when the world finally began to shift. Michelle McNamara's notes, thousands of pages of them, were being studied by the very detectives who once thought the case was lost. Her research had done something extraordinary. It had rebuilt the bridge between the past and the present. But Michelle herself would never see the end of her story, the silence that followed. In April 2016, the true crime world awoke to devastating news. Michelle McNamara had passed away suddenly in her sleep. The lamp on her desk still burned that night, the cursor still blinked on her unfinished manuscript, the words, "The Golden State Killer," shining faintly on the page. The woman who had dedicated her life to giving victims a voice had joined the silence she'd fought so hard against. Her husband, Patton Oswalt, described it later. She was so close, you could feel it in the house. The sense that she had found something, or someone. Her death rippled through everyone who had followed her work. Readers, detectives, survivors. For months, her absence felt like a light had gone out in the middle of an investigation that depended on it. The promise to finish what she started. Patton refused to let the story die with her. He gathered her hard drives, notebooks, sticky notes, and countless drafts, fragments of an unfinished masterpiece that told not just of a killer, but of obsession, empathy, and justice. With the help of her colleagues Billy Jensen and Paul Haynes, the team began organizing her research. What they found was staggering. Detailed timelines, geographic clustering theories, suspect analyses, and something even more important: a roadmap. Michelle had predicted the final step in catching the killer. He'll be found through the traces he left behind, not fingerprints, but bloodlines. Her words, written months before the technology was ready, turned out to be prophetic. The dawn of a breakthrough. 2 years later, in early 2018, investigators in California made an announcement that felt almost impossible. Through genetic genealogy, a suspect had been identified, a 72-year-old former police officer named Joseph James D'Angelo. He had lived quietly in a Sacramento suburb. He was married, had children, neighbors who called him polite. But hidden inside his DNA was the truth Michelle had spent her life searching for. When the arrest was made, detectives quoted her book title. "We caught the Golden State Killer. He's gone in the dark. No more. Justice. Finally." D'Angelo's arrest reignited the entire nation's fascination. Not with horror, but with hope. For the families who had waited over 40 years, Michelle's work had done what seemed impossible. She had kept the story alive long enough for science to catch up. In court, victims and their families spoke his name for the first time without fear. They described how they had survived and how Michelle had made them feel seen again. Her husband attended the hearing, sitting quietly in the back. When reporters asked him what Michelle would say if she were there, he replied, softly, she'd say, "We got him." The book that became a legacy. In 2018, her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was finally published. Patton made sure her words remained untouched, her voice preserved exactly as she left it. The first line read, "One day soon, you'll hear a car pull up to the curb, an engine cut out. You'll hear footsteps coming up your front walk. The doorbell rings, no side gates are left open. You're long past leaping over a fence. You're inside, safe in your bed. Because you know what I know." That line became prophecy. 2 months later, D'Angelo's doorbell rang, and justice walked in, the light beyond the darkness. The HBO series that followed became more than a crime documentary. It was a portrait of Michelle McNamara's heart. Her empathy redefined what it meant to be a true crime storyteller. She didn't write about monsters to glorify them. She wrote to unmask them so the living could breathe again. Her colleagues and family described her not as obsessed, but as driven by kindness. That kindness solved one of the darkest mysteries in American history. The closing scene fades in. Michelle's handwriting across her old notepad. Open the door, step into the light. The camera pans to her cluttered desk, the lamp glowing softly once more. Beside it, a copy of her finished book, its cover shimmering under the faint golden light. She chased a ghost for 10 years. In the end, she caught him, not with fear, but with truth. Her story reminds us that no matter how long the night lasts, there's always someone who refuses to stop looking. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because here, we bring to light the cases the world tried to forget. And remember, it only takes one person to shine a light bright enough to end the dark. This was I'll Be Gone in the Dark, the writer who hunted a ghost.